There was a time when one figure dominated every conversation in bodybuilding, not because of trophies, but because of his size that didn't seem human. Behind the incredible mass and power, however, were hidden struggles that few truly understood. In this video, we uncover the story no one really knew. This man was Greg Kovacs.
And now I too am a god!
He was born on the 16th of December 1968 in Niagara Falls, Ontario, Canada, where he grew up and started lifting weights when he was 17 years old. At first, weight training was not his main focus. He played hockey and used lifting as a way to get stronger for the sport, but very quickly he realized he enjoyed training far more than hockey itself, as the feeling of lifting heavy weights and seeing his body grow became more important to him than anything he was doing on the ice. Greg trained in his basement at home using equipment his parents bought for him.
Kovacs from Ontario, Canada, may be what you would call a sleeping giant. He trains by himself in the basement of his parents' farmhouse, but has been able to develop his body into much more than just a big farmhand. Greg is 6'2" and weighs nearly 300 pounds.
Because he trained alone and away from other lifters, he had no real idea how strong he actually was, because he had no one to compare himself to and only saw the numbers he could move, which to him felt normal. Until this happened.
I didn't realize how strong I was until one day I went to a powerlifting contest in my hometown, and the top bench was 430 pounds, and I looked at the weight and I said, wait a minute, that's not very heavy. I went up there and I benched it like 19 times, and then I walked out. And then there was another, I was reading a magazine and it said Ted Arcidi, the strongest man in the world, can behind the neck press 360 pounds for 4 reps. Nobody's ever pressed over 400 pounds behind the neck, and I was already doing 405 for like 6 to 8 reps behind the neck when I was 19 years old. So I thought, wow, I must be a lot stronger than most people.
His physical growth was just as extreme, since in his first year of training he went from 240 pounds to 300 pounds. A change most people would call incredible, but Greg saw it as a simple result of eating a lot and training hard. His parents didn't make a big deal out of it either. They just supported him, cooked his food, and made sure he had everything he needed to train. Even with his early progress, many people around the sport doubted him, saying he didn't have the genetics or that he would never make it as a bodybuilder. Greg ignored these comments because the only opinions that mattered to him came from his parents, who believed in him fully, and later from his wife, who became his biggest supporter and stayed with him through the hardest years of his career. Outside of bodybuilding, Greg also tried a more traditional path by studying electrical engineering, but his passion for training was stronger than anything else, so he dropped out after only 1 year. These early years shaped Greg's mindset, as he learned he was stronger than he realized, grew faster than anyone expected, and pushed forward even when people doubted him. His early life built the foundation for the massive figure he later became in bodybuilding. At the age of 21, Greg Kovacs entered his first bodybuilding competition, which was a small show in Timmins, Ontario. His weight was 270 pounds and he placed second, losing to a competitor who weighed only 170 pounds because at the time Greg did not know much about contest dieting or stage preparation. But it was still an important experience that taught him important lessons about posing, presentation, and conditioning. Over the next few years, Greg continued competing in local and national contests, placing second at the Ontario Championships and later competing at the Canadian Nationals and North American competitions, some of which were difficult for him, as he placed 11th at the North Americans and finished 6th at the Canadian Nationals. Each competition helped him learn more about proper preparation, training, and stage technique. Despite setbacks and mistakes, Greg remained committed to improving his physique and his performance on stage. His hard work eventually paid off when he won the Canadian Nationals and earned his IFBB Pro card, a victory that marked a major milestone in his career and finally allowed him to compete at the professional level. With this new status, Greg began traveling for photoshoots and sponsorships, particularly with MuscleTech, a supplement company he would become closely associated with. His massive size quickly made him one of the most recognizable figures in professional bodybuilding. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall and weighing over 400 pounds in the off-season, he towered over almost every other competitor of his era. Over time, people began referring to him as 6'4", a height increase that was part of a broader effort to make him appear even more monstrous and larger than he already was. His weight, however, was likely accurate as he genuinely carried more mass than anyone else on stage. This push to exaggerate his size went hand in hand with exaggerated strength claims, like in the famous MuscleTech Colossus video, where Greg is shown loading 6 plates on each side of a Smith machine for an incline press, making the lift appear to be around 600 pounds. A scene was filmed as if he's preparing for one of the heaviest incline presses ever recorded. But then the camera angle changes for a moment, and when it cuts back, one plate is missing from each side. So the real weight drops to 510 pounds. Yet the video continues as if nothing changed, an edited setup clearly designed to make Greg look far stronger than he actually was. Despite the marketing exaggerations, Greg was still incredibly large and impressively strong. His training routine focused on heavy lifts, full range of motion, and controlled negatives. He typically trained each muscle group only once per week, always paying attention to how his body recovered. Even without the inflated numbers, Greg Kovacs was likely the biggest bodybuilder of all time. But the companies behind him still wanted to make him look even bigger, stronger, and almost unreal. Greg made his professional debut at the Night of Champions, stepping on stage at a massive 325 pounds and finishing in 16th place, which was still an important first step in his pro career and a moment he learned a lot from. However, as the years passed, the extreme focus on size combined with heavy use of performance-enhancing drugs and the enormous amounts of food he consumed began to take a visible toll on his physique, making his muscles look unnatural. As a cherry on top, his delts became unusually rounded, which indicated use of synthol, a practice that made his body look even more distorted. One of the first major events came in 2004 at the Arnold Classic, where Greg's performance was a disaster, a result he later explained. 6 weeks before the show, he developed a severe bacterial infection in his lower intestines, an infection that caused non-stop stomach pain, vomiting, diarrhea, and extreme bloating, which meant he couldn't digest food properly and his body looked flat and swollen at the same time, leading Greg to admit that stepping on stage that year was a mistake, as he said he looked like a prisoner who was 6 months pregnant. And he stepped on stage bloated and far from his best, eventually leaving the scene without finishing his posing routine.
Exactly, that was my thought, that he has left the stage here a bit early.
When he tried to return in 2005 at the Niagara Falls Pro, the memories of the failed Arnold Classic still affected him, and he ended competition by not finishing his posing routine like last time. After retiring from competition, Greg started his own business and began coaching competitive athletes, but his personal life soon began to fall apart. Not long after his last contest, his marriage ended. Greg and his wife Kim had been together for 16 years, and she played a major role in his daily life. She cooked all his meals, prepared his food, handled his business calls, spoke with promoters, booked his appearances, and even answered questions for him during seminars. Greg was naturally introverted and relied on her for almost everything. When their marriage ended, he suddenly had to learn how to take care of himself, manage his responsibilities, and communicate on his own. He later said that losing her emotionally hurt more than any of his contest failures. Greg fell into a deep depression and also felt betrayed by people in bodybuilding who he thought were his friends. One example being Nasser El Sombati, who stayed at Greg's home for a month while dealing with visa problems, which made Greg believe they had a real friendship. But later Nasser said negative things about Greg and Kim online, an act that added even more stress during a period when Greg was already struggling to keep himself together. He admitted he had been too trusting and described himself as a naive big kid who became an easy target once his marriage ended. These experiences forced him to grow up fast and become more independent. During his years away from the stage, Greg tried to find a new path, openly admitting that he was never a top competitor, but believing he still had real value because of everything he had learned through decades of training, coaching, and studying the sport, even though many athletes he helped reach their best condition without giving him credit. Greg also faced legal trouble. On the 29th of November 2010, he was charged with extortion after a supplement store owner went to a bank to report that a group of men had demanded he withdraw a large sum of money. This case added even more stress to an already difficult time in Greg's life. In 2011 and 2012, Greg started sharing more of his life publicly on the RX Muscle forum run by his friend Dave Palumbo. He posted there every few weeks, writing long posts where he shared his knowledge, commented on the bodybuilding scene, joked around, and told crazy stories from his career. One of which was about him and Craig Titus, a guy who is currently in jail for a murder. It all started back in 1996, shortly after Greg Kovacs earned his pro card and was invited to a photo shoot at Gold's Gym in Venice. The same year, Craig Titus also turned pro, so the two quickly became friends and stayed in touch over the years. But then news broke that Craig was headed to federal prison for nearly 2 years for violating his probation from an earlier drug case after he was caught using anabolic steroids while already on supervised release. A mistake that cost him his MetRx contract and left him pushed out of the bodybuilding world. After Titus was released, he ran into Greg in Venice before a trip to Hawaii and expressed that he felt shut out of the industry and frustrated, which is why he invited him to stay in Canada. Though before heading there, Titus visited his family in Detroit, where Greg Kovacs also met Craig's wife, Kelly, for the first time. And when Titus and Greg arrived in Toronto, Titus immediately wanted to go to the strip club, where about an hour in, he mentioned that a group of guys had been making steroid freak comments about Greg. Even though Greg ignored them, Titus didn't. So after leaving, when the same group walked out to their truck, Titus called over the loudest guy pretending he wanted to talk. As the man approached, he confronted him, asking why he had been disrespectful. But before the man could respond, he was slapped to the ground with a single hit. Within seconds, the rest of the group came at them with bats and knives, prompting Greg to floor the gas while Titus yelled for him to go. And even though they managed to escape, there was a problem. Greg realized those guys lived nearby, but all Titus had to say was, "Don't worry, bro.
Life is good at the present time."
But it didn't make Greg feel any better. It was their first night together in Canada, and the incident left Greg wondering what the rest of Craig Titus's visit might bring. The posts allowed fans to see more of his personality. Greg often talked about feeling like a freak or a zoo attraction, and through his writing he showed a more honest, open and human side than most people had ever seen. Messages that revealed someone who was trying to rebuild his identity, reconnect with the bodybuilding community, and become a better version of himself. He was last seen posting on the 15th of March 2012, after which he went completely silent for more than a year, a period with no new messages, no updates, and no clues about what he might have been dealing with. On the 22nd of November 2013 at approximately 9:50 p.m., Greg Kovacs died from a heart attack. After years of extreme drug use and carrying an enormous amount of body weight throughout his career, it seemed inevitable that his health would eventually give out. His passing became a sad but expected end for someone who pushed his physique far beyond human limits. Thanks for watching, subscribe to support the channel and stay up to date with future videos.